I am bringing on TikTok caregiver friend with us today. Kait Giordano is the co-founder of the Melty Middle, a platform focused on rethinking how we approach care. Living in the sandwich generation, raising a young child while caring for aging parents at home, Kait brings perspective shaped by lived experience. You decided to have them live with you about the same time you also realized your family was growing. So you had to think outside the box. Tell us how that worked.
At that point, my dad had been with me for a year, so they were living separately. And then about 2 weeks after that is when I found out that I was pregnant. And so we very quickly had to kind of adjust everything.
I want to talk to you a little bit about just the sandwich itself and how you show up differently as a parent versus as a caregiver for your parents.
When caregiving, especially sandwich caregiving, don't think of it as putting your life on hold. It's a continuation of your life, and it may not be what you envisioned, but you're not stopping your life and then continuing again when the caregiving role is over.
Welcome to the From Guilt to Good podcast, where we discuss all the things caregivers wish people would talk about, but don't, won't, or can't. Hi, my name is Jeanette Yates, the founder of The Self-Caregiver, and I cared for my own mother for several decades and now help caregivers set boundaries and use simple tools that make care and life easier so they can feel good, not guilty. And yet again, I am bringing on another TikTok caregiver friend with us today. Kait Giordano is the co-founder of the Melty Middle, a platform focused on rethinking how we approach care. Living in the sandwich generation, raising a young child while caring for aging parents at home, Kait brings perspective shaped by lived experience. Along with her husband, Tamron, she explores the ethical and practical realities of caregiving. Their platform reflects a growing awareness that many caregiving challenges are shaped by a broader societal shift away from connected, interdependent communities. Much of what they share centers on dementia, challenging assumptions about decline, and emphasizing continued participation and presence. Kait and Tamron chose a path that steps outside of many traditional care models, encouraging others to define care in a way that feels right for their own families. And honestly, this is why I wanted to have her on. Every time I watch Kait's content and Tamron's, he does a lot too, I am inspired and I just feel my heart welling up with love for multi-generational and intergenerational families. It sometimes makes me sad that I didn't do more of that on my own. But Kait, I am so happy to have you here today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to dive in. And one of the first things that I always ask people to do is share their own caregiving experiences. So just tell us a little bit about who you care for and your connection to caregiving.
So my connection to caregiving's kind of long-standing. I started in my early adulthood, kind of right after high school, helping my parents care for my dad's mom, so my grandmother, who also had Alzheimer's. Shortly after that, I cared for my sister who had terminal cancer. And then I got a little break in my late 20s until about 30 when I started taking care of my parents who both have dementia.
So let's talk a little bit about why you decided to and how it happened, because I think your story is like both parents didn't move in at the same time. So tell us a little bit about how you decided to move your parents in with you.
So, really, right after the pandemic is when we started to notice that there was a big shift in their day to day lives and how they were doing caring for themselves. I think we were definitely kind of expecting dementia of some capacity to be in my dad's future. And so that wasn't so surprising, but I think it was a lot younger than we were expecting and felt kind of quick. And so we started in kind of just a slow, supportive, standing back, but seeing what they needed a little bit additional help on. My dad had lost a little bit of weight. So then we are like, okay, well, obviously there's a food component here. And we started making all of their meals. And as time went on, we started to kind of notice that my mom didn't kind of grasp what was going on and was having a lot of trouble keeping up with his care. We had already taken his keys away and we'd have conversations about the fact that he wasn't driving anymore, but then we'd find out that she was just giving him his her keys and kind of going like, oh, wait a second, like where's this disconnect coming from? And so he would kind of decline and he'd come live with my husband and I for a month, 6 weeks, and we'd kind of get him back on his feet, get to the bottom of kind of what was going on, if it was a UTI or whatever. And then he'd go back home and it would continue to happen. And at the same time, we were not getting a clear diagnosis on what kind of was going on with my mom. It was just sort of like she's overwhelmed and she's depressed, but that's sort of the extent of it. And so it took, all in all, over 2 years to kind of get both of their diagnoses and a clear idea of what was happening with both of them. And by the time my mom got her diagnosis, the neurologist was just like, she cannot live by herself. She cannot, and so it was just, we had a long time understanding that it was likely that we were going to absorb her as well. At that point, my dad had been with me for a year. So they were living separately. And then about 2 weeks after that is when I found out that I was pregnant. And so we very quickly had to adjust everything.
Right. And so you talk about on your TikTok, which is the Melty Middle, that you decided to have them live with you about the same time you also realized your family was growing. So you had to think outside the box. And so tell us a little bit about the new house and how you built and all that stuff. Tell us how that worked.
We had really hoped that we would be able to stay in our original home and add on to that to kind of make the additional space for my parents. But when it came down to it and all the changes happened, we just didn't have time for that level of adjustment. It was sad because we'd bought our first home and flipped it from the ground up ourselves and kind of made it into our forever home. And so we were just like, what do you mean we have to leave now? But we very quickly needed more space. And so we just started looking and we're really fortunate to find a home that had been on the market for kind of a long time because it's a weird house, weird floor plan, but it had 2 bedrooms on the main level with a bathroom between them, which is really ideal in our situation. And so by March, we were moved. So we kind of started in January and were moved into the new house by March. One of the benefits of doing it this way, I don't know if I'm kind of going off track here, but we were able to keep our home, my husband and I's original home, and we rent that out. So that's how we've kind of developed to have some passive income to be able to work less. And yeah, by Easter of 2024, we were in a new place and yeah.
So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the adjustments that you've made in the house over the last couple of years, but I want us to go into what this experience has made you rethink about how we live as a society in the Western culture.
Yeah, so it definitely brings front and center how, in my opinion, kind of ridiculous it is how separately we all already live. I feel like this conversation of caregiving, it's kind of interesting that it's a conversation that exists at all because it's basically how we've lived up until, the very recent past.
The term caregiving may have been invented not too long ago, but the concept of caring for people in your family is as old as time.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly, exactly, and so there's no new phenomenon happening. We've just really gotten away in society from that being a way that we can operate. It's virtually impossible to operate in the way that we have maneuvered, and the sacrifices are not sacrifices that we're comfortable making a lot of the times in the way that we live.
Yes, and your opinion isn't a judgment call. It's just a reality of the way culture is now. I was recently talking to someone who doesn't live in the United States, and they were telling me that in their culture, families always live together. So, like your mom and dad would live where they live, and then you and your husband would live in the same house or an adjacent house. And then your siblings and their families would also live close. And so caregiving kind of happened organically, whether it was tending to the children or tending to the aging people or whoever needed it. It was a communal effort. And that has changed where this person's from as well, that just for financial reasons or jobs or whatever, people are moving apart, moving away. And that's just the way things are now. So one of the things that you talk about is a lot of the problems that are caregiving problems are connected to this idea that we do not have this multi-generational living situation that we can care. Is that an accurate way to say that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, I mean, there's a lot of layers to it, in a way it's a women's issue. Like, women were just innately the caregivers in the homes, that's just not the way that it is anymore.
Well, and I think about that a lot, and one of the things that really has compelled me about your content is, well, first of all, it reminds me of what my mom used to always say and always tell me stories about when she was little. There was always some old relative living with them. And then when they would go to Aunt so and so's house, there was an old relative living there. Like everyone was always housing someone from the family. So even though they all didn't live in the same compound, it was all, they were all in the same little town. And great aunt so and so or granny such and who would just be there, and they would be there for a little bit, and then they'd go stay with another relative probably. And then so there was like respite care built in. And my mom would tell me stories. I will say this, for most of my life, I heard about how wonderful this was and how great it was, right? And then towards the end, she started spilling the beans that actually, even with that, there was still burnout and there was still like Aunt so and so one time was taking care of great Aunt so and Aunt so had it one day. And so she got into the car with the children and she drove out to the field where her husband was. And she said, great Aunt so and so's at the house and I'm out of here. I gotta, and so I was like, oh, so even back in the olden days, burnout still existed, but there was a sense of multi-generational care. And then of course, when my aunt got burned out, another aunt took on great aunt, right? So there was that respite care. And to your point, there all of this was woman care, right? Women caring. But there was that sense of support, familial support that a lot of us don't have due to distance or emotional distance. But what you've created and what you share on social, which I think we talked about this one time before, like the first time we talked, you acknowledge that it's not all perfect, right? That this is a hard thing and you're making the best of it, you and your husband. Can you talk a little bit about how you've intentionally brought your parents into your home, and then you're also raising your son? So this is not just like oh crap, I guess they're coming to live with us, but you've made this intentional choice. And how does that turn into like a million intentional choices? It's not just the one choice to let them come, but you make a lot of choices. Can you talk a little bit about those little choices that help make this work for you?
I'll backtrack a little bit and say that part of the reason I was able, or that I did make this choice, is that I grew up in the sandwich generation. My parents were a little bit older when I was growing up, and so I was seeing firsthand them taking care of their parents. And I think when you see that, it feels a little bit less foreign, or you can anticipate that something like that may be in your future. And so I always knew that would be a role that I would be taking on. And I am a planner. It's kind of ridiculous how much of a planner I am. And so, and that's good and bad. You can't plan for everything. You have to be able to pivot. It kind of went step by step. The first step was knowing that we all needed to be under one roof. And so you tackle that and you get that taken care of, and that kind of settles. And then you think, okay, now we're going to have a young child in the mix. And so then you think, okay, well, that means cameras and gates at the stairs and, those type of things. And then once that's all sorted, we started to think about what engagement between my parents and our son would kind of look like. And that kind of happened organically. You kind of just have to, there's not everything that you can fully anticipate. And that turned out to be better than we thought it would be. Leading up to, and during my pregnancy, we were kind of conditioned to be very kind of fearful of what that would look like, about, oh, it's going to be quite dangerous. They're not going to be able to really interact with your son. And not that I didn't put any weight into that, but that just hasn't been our experience at all. The other aspect of it is knowing that with a child, our attention is going to be so split all the time that we just needed there to be a lot of thoughtful safety mechanisms in place. I think we made a video about how we chose to put in an induction stove. That was just another layer of, they're not going to be able to burn the house down. We're not going to have our eyes on them every moment that they're in the kitchen. And it's also safer for my son. But then also trying to keep it to where they can feel very involved still in the household and in the day to day. And so that's where like things like the dishwasher came into play. So basically, my husband and I have taught ourselves kind of on like YouTube University how to do home renovations. And my dad largely taught Tamron a lot of those skills as well. And so we're kind of nerds about just like cool things that you see on Pinterest and think like, oh, if we ever do this again, this is what we'd want to do. And so, as sad as we were to leave our first home that we had really turned into what we considered our dream forever home, it was fun to have the opportunity to like maybe do some things that we didn't get to do the first time around and the benefits of it. So, my mom gets dizzy from bending over, the blood pressure kind of situation. And emptying the dishwasher is her favorite thing in the world to do. I mean, it's just one of those things that she really feels like it's how she contributes. And so my husband very quickly was like, we're going to get that dishwasher that we've seen, all that time ago. And then we just talked to the cabinet people, and it's a thing that they do. And so that's what we did.
So yeah, so you guys, I'll put it in the show notes. I'm going to link her whole channel, but I'll also link the specific video because it's a video of her mom unloading the dishwasher, which has been elevated up off the floor so she doesn't have to bend over and stand on her head to do her favorite thing. And I just love that your response to, she can't bend over anymore was not, okay, she can't unload the dishwasher, but it was, how can we help her still be able to do what she likes to do, which is unload the dishwasher. So I thought that is something we can extrapolate out to the way we are tending to our loved ones. And like I said, I never want us to feel like we have to compare each other's stories like, oh, I should have done that. But it did make me pause and look at different aspects of my caregiving journey and say, oh, there were so many times where I was just like, yep, not doing that anymore, which I'm sure there's some of those things too, right, in your experience. But I do love the idea. And it's something I'm going to put in my back pocket for the next time I have the opportunity to give care to somebody. I'm going to say, okay, how are we going to make the things that they want to do as easy as possible for as long as possible. So I do love that. Another thing that your channel talks about quite openly, and one of the things I really want us to dive into is the more about the autonomy that you try to give your parents, specifically around things that some people might say, oh, like that might be dangerous. And I'm specifically thinking of your dad and the leaves. That's what I'm thinking of. I loved watching him in the leaves. And tell me a little bit more about how you decide what to let your parents do that maybe not be the safest thing, but it is also something they want to do. It also keeps them moving. There's benefits. So can you talk a little bit about how you choose and what are some benefits you've seen from doing things that way?
So it's interesting because not everyone's experience, obviously, with dementia is lateral. And so there were during that time, and obviously that was a couple years ago, that was when we just had my dad, when he was still doing a lot of the, like fire pits on his own and tillers and saws and things that he did his whole life and loved and felt very comfortable with. From the outside, a lot of people would not have known that he was even had Alzheimer's. And so it's kind of one of those things that's interesting that in his experience, it was he couldn't really remember or understood how to cook for himself anymore. So that's the support that he needed. And he couldn't live alone, but there was still a whole lot. I mean, at that point, he was still going out on walks with our dog around the neighborhood by himself. And so I think it's just not everything gets lost at once. And you can really tell what they're still capable of doing, what they're not capable of doing. And so, like, could he remember to take his medications or remember that he needed to eat breakfast? No, but he could absolutely still look out in the yard and say, I need to clean up those leaves and get out there and do it. It's interesting because we would always have our eye on him, and make sure. And there just never was a time where he did anything that we were like, oh boy, oh no. And this may not be true for everyone with Alzheimer's, but definitely in my experience, they can tell you what their limitations are. At least my father could tell us. There were times where he still very much wanted to drive and it was a daily thing of, like, well, I don't want you to have to take me everywhere and blah, blah, blah. And he'd go and sit in the driver's seat of the car. And every time he would realize, oh, I don't know the next step. I don't know what to do anymore. And so it wasn't like we had to say, "Get out of the car, you're not allowed to drive, you can't do whatever," he would realize it for himself and step out and say, "I think you should take me where we need to go." And you're just like, "Okay, that worked itself out." And so he understood his limits. When you just step back and don't try and control everything, you can see that, at least in our case.
Well, and one of the other things that I love about how you speak about your experience, and I try to do the same whenever I'm sharing mine, is like, we're only sharing our experience. That's what we know. You're an expert in your situation. I'm an expert in my situation with my mom. And then I think other people learn lessons or find encouragement or inspiration, but we can't prescribe what works for another family. And I think that's another thing that you and Tamron do so well is this is what works for our family. This is what we've learned. This is what we've noticed. One thing that you can really tell from looking at your videos is that your parents love being there and they do love interacting with their grandson, which is, if you're listening or watching, go into the show notes, click and go find some of these videos because they're so encouraging to show what we all really want and however we can make it happen for our caregiving situation is for our person that we're caring for, our people that we're caring for to feel loved and cared for. And then also to have other parts of our family not feeling neglected, which I really love how, and I also shout out to Tamron. He's not on this call, but he is also involved. Like this is a decision y'all made together as a couple, as a family. And he is working right alongside you and right alongside your parents and caring for your parents, your son, along with you and caring for you. And y'all are caring for each other. And to me, it seems like a utopia to me in some ways, which I know is naive. Like I said, I know it's not all sunshine and roses, but I love that in all of the stuff out there about caregiving and how hard it is and how the system is broken and we've got all these problems and there's a crisis and there's there's all of this, that there are a few moments that we can take and just say, even for a moment, even though I know that the Melty Middle's whole life isn't this walk in the park that's happening right now with the baby and the parents, for a moment that exists in the world. And I think it's a good vibes to throw to put out into the world. This is possible, even if it's not possible 24/7, it's possible 5 minutes at a time. And so I'm very, very encouraged by that. I want to talk to you a little bit about just the sandwich itself and how you show up differently for as a parent versus as a caregiver for your parents.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is really a map for, well, obviously, my son, or maybe not obviously, but this is my first child. And so I'm a new mom. I've not done this before. And a lot of caregiving feels a lot more natural to me than parenting because I've just been doing it longer. My husband and I have a good system that's very divide and conquer. And so, in a situation where everybody needs something, I'm kind of in charge of my son and he's in charge of my parents. But there is definitely, I think, a benefit to kind of what you talk about with how it's seeing kind of like a utopia. It's easier to stay positive, I think, when we're daily faced with looking at the entire life cycle and when it's death is not so just in our face constantly because we also have new life. And I often say we live where first words and forgotten words collide. And there is something to be said. And I think a lot about as my son gets older and how he's going to need me less and my parents are going to always need me more. And so the expectation is that he is learning skills and they are unlearning skills. And so I do often think that we're going to have to very regularly be able to pivot so that there's not too much burden either on my son, but also the fact that, the expectation is that he will be gaining independence. And with both of them, both situations, I'm surprisingly hands off, especially with my son. Like, you don't know what kind of parent you're necessarily going to be until you get in there. But I really just try and look at my role as just as a guide. And I just stand back. And when it's apparent I need to step in on any front. That's just kind of how we look at it.
And I'm curious if this is true, but one of the things that strikes me is, and I mentioned it earlier, the intentionality of your life, of your day to day. One of the things that a lot of caregivers want, me included, was a routine, a schedule. I need, things to go XYZ. And so it would really bother me when, of course, my mom's health did not want to cooperate, or my kids, or whatever, like there was just life was happening. Is it hard for you to, first of all, do you have like a routine? Does that help things, or is it better for you not to have a routine? Do you wake up every day and say, okay, what are we going to need today versus yesterday? How does that work for you? What's your wheelhouse? Where do you feel most comfortable, routine or?
So I still work 3 days a week. I'm a independent hairdresser, so I travel to my clients. And so, those days are pretty set in stone because I'm going to be out of the house. We do try and keep a fairly stringent routine for my parents just because that's what makes them more comfortable, especially with just like waking up in the morning and breakfast and those type of things. But of course, all the time, there could be someone doesn't want to eat this morning or we're moving a little slower. I mean, you never know exactly what you're going to get. And there are great days where it's like we have lunch on time and my son wants to take a nap at just the perfect time. And then there are times where it's like he's teething and we've got, and so there's a little bit of both. And I think the biggest thing is to have structure, but have flexibility in yourself to be able to pivot and not really just get upset when it doesn't go the way that you need it to go. And the interesting thing about caregiving, especially in the capacity that we're doing it, is that I look at it as everyone in our home is kind of a caregiver. Care happens in all directions at all times. And so, there are times that more is asked of me, more is asked of my husband. Things are flowing in all directions. And that is really what keeps us able to do everything that we're doing because it looks impossible in a lot of ways. And yeah.
I really like that too, because I think we often think about what we're giving, like the care that we're giving to someone else, and taking a moment to recognize that even your parents are giving something to you, right? Their presence is giving something to you. And then, of course, how they interact with your son and your family is a gift as well. One of the things that you said reminded me that about when I was raising my children when they were young, and they were babies like your child is, and how we had to have a routine, but we didn't have to have a schedule. So the same things happened at bedtime every night, bath, teeth brush, story night, or whatever. But it didn't always have to happen at 7:30 or whatever. Like it was a routine. We still did the same thing, and we could do it here, or we could do it at grandma's house, or we could do, the routine stay the same, but it may not always be your bed. It may be after a family dinner at a restaurant, and then we come home, and that really helped us develop both the flexibility, but also the structure that we needed. So I think that's a good tip that may not work for everybody, but I think it's worth a shot. So Kait, I could talk to you all the time. I think what you and Tamron are doing, and to your point, how your whole family is caring for each other, is such an important message. I want to make sure that everybody knows that they can find you on TikTok and on Instagram and Facebook. The Melty Middle, your story is compelling. Thank you so much for sharing it. Is there anything else you want to tell our caregivers before we sign off today?
I think all I would say is just when caregiving, especially sandwich caregiving, don't think of it as putting your life on hold. It's a continuation of your life, and it may not be what you envisioned, but you're not stopping your life and then continuing again when the caregiving role is over. And yeah.
Yeah, we can live our lives in the moment of caregiving. In that sandwich, we can still be living our lives. I love that. Thank you, Kait, so much for joining me today. And tell Tamron I said thank you as well. And thank you all for joining me today on the From Guilt to Good podcast. I'm going to link everything in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. If this conversation resonated with you, please share it with a caregiver in your life. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also find more resources for caregiving and learning about care technology at JeanetteYates.com. And until next time, feel good, not guilty.